So I'm going to talk about the notion of method and post-method. And what I'm reporting on is an original paper that I did which questioned the notion that methods were dead. And I followed that up with some research into the attitudes of teachers towards the concept of method. You've got both those papers which you can read, but I'll be talking mainly around the second paper, which is concerned with whether teachers believe that methods are dead. Um, so about 10 years ago, the prevalent view amongst methodologists was that methods were dead, and that we had moved beyond methods. This is Richards in 1990. And then the notion of post-method, the post-method condition, was the terminology used by Kumaravadivelu. Other writers like Brown, this is the Brown who wrote your textbook, in a paper made frequent references to the death of methods. I'm just quoting now. We lay to rest methods, recently interred methods, requiem for methods. It was as though methods was some kind of Dracula that had to have a stake driven through its heart. Here I want to argue that the notion that methods are dead is untenable, and in fact we have really nothing to fear about methods, so we don't really need to consider them dead. Let me see if I can define methods, because this is not easy to do, and I'm going to give you three ways of defining methods. The first one is taken from Oller. And we can say that this is a small case definition of method, and it's pretty inclusive, as you can see. Methods include programs, curricula, procedures, demonstration, modes of presentation, research findings, tests, manners of interaction, materials, text, films, videos, computers, and more. In fact, just about everything we use, or every activity, or every piece of technology we use in the classroom appears to fall under this definition of method. Second definition, and I'm going to use an uppercase M to describe this, is really a very pejorative definition. So let's take a quote from Brown. Virtually all language teaching methods make the oversimplified assumption that what language teachers do in the classroom can be conventionalized into a set of procedures that fits all contexts. Defining feature here is that a method is something which is intended to fit all contexts. Let's take another quote from Richards and Rogers. A method refers to a specific instructional design or system. It is relatively fixed in time. Fixed in time here referring to those, for example, those designer methods of the 70s. And there is generally little scope for individual interpretation. Methods are learnt through training. Of course, it'd be wonderful if a method could be instilled into a teacher so that they faithfully reproduce the method. It would be something very strange, because what we know about humans and what we know about teachers is that they interpret methods in different ways in the classroom. Thankfully, they interact with the students and they extemporize, and the notion of a method is something that it changes in the practice of the classroom. Finally, a third definition of a method is that used by Richards and Rogers in their very seminal paper, which you've already read, or you should already have read, um, and in which this case, method is an umbrella term under which we have approach, design, and procedure. So here, a method is theoretically related to an approach, is organizationally determined by a design, and is practically realized in procedure. So in this sense, it's certainly not pejorative. And as you can see, method is the broader term and approach is the smaller term. What we'll see, of course, is that approach tends to be the term that is preferred when we describe the communicative approach. And method is often used in that pejorative sense to describe designer methods. Natural approach, well, that's using the word approach, but Suggestopedia, total physical response, etc. So here's the question: are methods really dead? Have we really gone beyond methods? Bloch argues that while method has been discredited at the etic level, that is, in the thinking and nomenclature of scholars, Brown, Richards and Rogers, Kumaravadivelu, it certainly retains a great deal of vitality at the grassroots, the emic level. That is, it's still part of the nomenclature of lay people and teachers, hopefully people like you and me. So, in a sense, in this paper, I'm looking at what the lay people think, what the teachers think about methods to arrive at a conclusion as to whether they're really dead. So this is the research design of this paper, and I'm going to talk about some of the results, not all of the results here. So it involved a questionnaire and follow-up interviews with 30 teachers. These are 30 teachers who were either master's students or had already were taking master's courses or had already graduated. I looked at the language learning teaching autobiographies that were taken from several classes. These particular autobiographies were assignments in which students had to talk about their language learning experience. And this amounted to over 200,000 words, 43 native English speaker teachers and 39 non-native English speaker teachers. Teaching journals, and this amounted to something like 180,000 words, 29 journals, and finally discussion board postings. I'm mainly going to talk about the results of the questionnaires. So these are 30 teachers. 20 were pre-methods course and 10 post. So 20 were before they'd taken a methods class, 10 after they'd taken it. And that's 30 native English speaker teachers and 17 non-native English speaker teachers. 20 teachers had 2 years or more of English language teaching experience. So a lot of these teachers were pretty experienced, had taught before they took this methods class. And so here are some responses, and what I'm looking at here are voices of teachers responding to the kinds of questions that Brown and Kumaravadivelu and Richards and Rogers have been asking about the post-method condition. So firstly, I asked the teachers how they would describe their teaching methodology. Most of the teachers responded that they described it in terms of communicative language teaching and in terms of being eclectic. So some example. I'm very eclectic. These are different teachers. I'm very eclectic, ALM, GT, CLT, humanistic, a little bit of everything depending on the context. Perhaps eclectic is the best word, said another teacher, that can best describe my teaching method. And another one said, I don't want to stick to one thing. Another teacher said, I have an eclectic method. I like to take a piece from here and a piece from there and just combine them all. And finally, I teach according to the situation. I feel it's important to vary the approach, especially when you spend 24 hours a week with the same class. That's a very intensive language situation. Then I asked the teachers how they defined method. And they tended to define it in terms of techniques as being something which was very goal-oriented and something which was systematic. So again, these are the voices of the teachers. A conjunct of techniques and ways of teaching a language based on systematic principles and procedures. Another teacher said, carrying something out according to a plan. A way you teach with techniques. A set of techniques with a focus on something, e.g. grammar. A technique, a way of doing something that has to be planned. A systematic way of presenting the material. So methods are techniques, and they're highly systematic, and they're oriented towards a particular goal. A further element that most teachers were concerned about was that methods were context sensitive. Now, Kumaravadivelu suggested that macro strategies are the basis from which teachers choose particular strategies in terms of being context sensitive. It appeared from my research that teachers were already very sensitized to the notion of context sensitivity. So one teacher said, method is a way of arriving to one's teaching goals. Method is a manner in which a system is implemented to complete a specific task. A method applies to a structured idea that a teacher follows, combining theory and practice that best suits their learners' needs. Another teacher said, the constant use of cleverness which disarms the barriers the student wants to put up, which gets us from point A, the student's current knowledge or ability, to point B, the desired knowledge or ability. Given the fact that students may be in class at 7 a.m. and at 9 p.m., so they didn't always have the required energy. So it's trying to give them the required energy. That's a very interesting situation. Obviously, the students are going to class, say, before they go to work, or they're going after they go to work. So the particular methods, the techniques here are very sensitive to a situation in which students are tired and they have to be motivated and they have to be given particular tasks which they can do and carry through and defeat their tiredness. Another question I asked was, do you distinguish between method and approach? Interesting, 7 teachers said there was no distinction. For example, here's a quote from one teacher. For me, it's a difficult distinction. I think the words are adopted along a historical timeline and created just for the reason of wanting to depart from a certain era. Really, on a fundamental level, they're the same thing. Approach is a political term to distinguish the departure from previous methods. And that's interesting because we do talk about the communicative approach and we do talk about the audiolingual method. 11 teachers believe that, along with Richards and Rogers in their article, that approach was a subset of method, but almost just as many felt that method was a subset of approach. So there's a lot of confusion about these two particular terms. I asked teachers to react to this particular statement, and this is one of the statements of, I think it's Brown. Virtually all language teaching methods make the oversimplified assumption that what language teachers do in the classroom can be conventionalized into a set of procedures that fits all contexts. Most teachers responded by talking about the uniqueness of each teaching context and the individuality of the teacher. In a sense, what they're saying is it doesn't matter what the method is designed to do. In reality, teachers make those adjustments based upon contextual requirements. Every class is unique, said one teacher. When I use the term method, I'm not suggesting that this method applies to all contexts. As a teacher, and that's an interesting quote because that's going back to perhaps the first definition of method. As a teacher, we don't just have to choose one method. The way we use a method depends on the teacher. So here's the acknowledgement that despite the fact that methods could be defined pejoratively as one size fits all, there's a recognition that they're malleable, they change depending on the context. This teacher sees a dialectic between the simplification of method and the complexity of the classroom, and it's a very interesting way of putting this. I do think there's a dialogue going on where teachers are trying to address these concerns. You do have to simplify your views on language learning when you go into a class. And this refers back to the notion of abstraction that I was describing earlier. It would be very difficult to address every student's individual needs in a multi-level, multilingual classroom. Teaching makes you simplify things, makes you conventionalize them. But I do think that most teachers are aware of that problem, and that's why I somewhat disagree. Here's another quote I asked my participants to react to. Methods are relatively fixed in time. This is Richards and Rogers. Leave little scope for individual interpretation and are learnt through training. One teacher responded, I think there's always room for interpretation and adaptation. Of course. I do think that some methods are built into their philosophy that teachers will ultimately put their own interpretation on the method. But there are also some that are trying to hand over a method on a platter and say, here is how you do it. But there's still the notion that some methods suggest interpretation. And here's, I think, Richard's quote, methods are dead. In our current practices, we have gone beyond methods. How did the teachers respond? Well, 28 teachers disagreed in some way with the statement. Knowing methods helps teaching. More options. Knowing methods is useful to decide our practices. We need to know methods in order to make our choices. Not dead. Certainly, there's no one answer. We are more selective. I don't think methods are dead and that we have gone beyond them. I think there are pieces of methods which are incorporated into most teaching practices. I don't think methods are dead in that they are no longer useful. I don't know anyone who will say, this is my method and I will subscribe to no other. Most teachers will say, well, I like this from this method and this from that method. We've gone beyond methods, but they are still there. We can still refer back to them. We can still incorporate them. And that basically is a position I have been arguing in the sense. Going beyond something is not abandoning it. They're still there for us to refer back to and to use. And another quote that my teachers responded to. We don't need methods. We need to study what successful teachers do and copy them. Oh, this drew quite a remarkable reaction. Maybe it's the notion of copying. Teachers hated this idea. And this is the basic idea of best practices. One teacher said, I don't think we have to copy what other teachers do. What works for a particular teacher may not work for me in a particular context. And that's the context sensitivity, in which kind of is quite a powerful argument against best practices approach. Finally, well, not finally, but here's a quote from Diane, Larson, Freeman, I think, which is very illuminating. People who say we are beyond methods are making more of a political statement than anything else. I think they misconstrue what a method can be. They're saying there is no room in language teaching for formulas for prescriptive practices to be imposed on teachers worldwide. Certainly, I have no quarrel with that. But I think it's a big mistake to mix up method and its implementation, or how a method is used. I wouldn't want to impose a method on anybody, but it seems to me the more methods we have, the more we see the variety of human experience, the more we have a bigger palette from which to paint our picture. We have more choices. It's a question of expanding, revising one's thought, inaction repertoire. And that's very much what it's about, is a repertoire, having as big a repertoire as possible, or as I think one of you said, a tool belt with many, many tools in it. Okay, so let me see if I can pick out a few points from the data I've just, from those interviews, questionnaires I've just looked at. Few teachers define method in the pejorative sense used by post-methodologists. That's definition 2. Second, most teachers think of methods in terms of techniques, which realize a set of principles or goals. And 3, when describing their methodology, teachers overwhelmingly use the term eclectic. And teachers' eclecticism appears to be based on an awareness of the existence of different methods and a willingness to draw from each of them. Thankfully, there are many methods which allow us to be eclectic. And finally, eclecticism is most often connected to notions of teacher autonomy and context sensitivity. A knowledge of methods is equated with a set of options which empowers teachers to respond meaningfully to particular classroom contexts. In this way, knowledge of methods is seen as crucial to teacher growth. Okay, so let's look at the implications then. Teachers' autonomy, and 2, methods and foundational knowledge, and 3, I think we have to agree that methods are not dead. So if we look at the first one there in terms of autonomy, what we can say and what we can admit to, and this is contrary to what most theorists say, is that teachers are far more intellectually discerning than applied linguists give them credit for. So, just as proponents of designer methods often doubted that teachers left to their own devices would teach systematically, post-methodologists fear teachers will slavishly follow whatever method they have been trained in. The evidence here suggests that the obsession of both sets of theories underestimate the intellectual autonomy and discernment of the practitioner. So don't let me down on this. I believe that you are far superior to the people who create methods and the applied linguists who research them, because you're a teacher and you react to the reality of the classroom. Secondly, and this is why I'm spending quite a lot of time looking at the history of methods and looking at methods which are no longer fashionable, because I do believe that it is part of the foundational knowledge of being a second language teacher. So teachers' interest in knowing about methods, both as a source of options and a basis for eclecticism in the classroom, suggests that the history of methods should be a key component of the foundational knowledge of teachers. And so I believe that's important, and that's why it's important to look at all these different methods. And finally, methods are not dead. Teachers are aware of both the usefulness of methods and the need to go beyond them. An interesting quote here. The prefix post does not mean a final closure, nor does it announce the end of that which it is appended. Rather, it suggests a thinking through and beyond the problematics of that which it is appended. So it's not that we've abandoned methods, but that we've been able to think through them. So post-method need not imply the end of methods, but rather an understanding of the limitations of the notion of method and a desire to transcend those limitations. And here's one final teacher voice. I think that teachers should be exposed to all methods, and they themselves would build their own methods or decide what principles they would use in their teaching. We cannot ignore methods and all the facts that were considered by those who created or used them in their teaching. We need a basis for building our own teaching. And that's very much my position, my philosophy in designing this particular course. So I hope that you are open and to all these methods, and you can search out and seek whatever truths are in these methods, whatever is applicable to your particular teaching context. Let me just suggest this, that in terms of method and post-method, there's an interesting dialectic at work here. In that sense of methods being, we can think of them as being top-down. That's the one-size-fits-all. And that can relate to teacher self-belief, teacher passion, teacher subjectivity. To be honest with ourselves, that we do believe that there are particular methods that we should use, and we tend to impose them because we are passionately believe them. And teacher passion in the classroom is a powerful, powerful source of learning. Students do respond when teachers are passionate about what they're doing. When they're not passionate, they tend not to respond. So there is a tendency, or there should be a tendency in all good teachers, to have some kind of desire to impose certain methods because they feel they have a certain universal applicability. At the same time, teachers need to develop their methods from bottom up. And this is where the importance of the post-method condition. If we want to be effective teachers, then we have to develop strategies and principles in response to context, in response to needs, in response to the kind of reflection we do about our teaching, which may be through action research. And it may also develop from a certain healthy skepticism about methods and what they can achieve. And this is very much more of an objective approach. So what we get to in the middle is a kind of informed eclecticism. Not just eclectic, but we've informed ourselves based upon this dialectic. Or another way of describing this is a principle pragmatism. So what I see in terms of what happens in the classroom is the dialectic of these two forces, top-down, the passion of the teacher, because they endorse and believe in certain ways of behaving and acting in the classroom, and at the same time the bottom-up approach where the teacher is always second-guessing their particular choices and options in terms of methods. They're skeptical about them. They're trying to find out what particular technique, what particular method best fits this particular group of students in this particular context. So what happens in the classroom is probably something that comes out of this dialectic of top-down and bottom-up approaches to teaching.